Hi everyone, Pastor David here. We had a little problem on Wednesday night at the class. We had a good class, but I didn't get it recorded. We had a little technical issue. Hopefully that won't continue. But I didn't want to leave those of you who were not able to be there out. And so this is Friday afternoon, and I'm here at my desk, and I'm just going to go through some of the highlights from Wednesday's class, so that you don't miss out on lesson two. I started to give you some background to the New Testament last week, and we're going to continue with that. Remember, our goal in this class is, first of all, that you will know your story. If you're a Christian, if you belong to Jesus Christ, the Bible is your story, and you need to know the Bible to know who you are. The other thing you need to know is the living God. And God speaks to us through his word, and the New Testament is his word to us, and we encounter Jesus in it. So that is what we're about. But we're doing some tough background work, laying a little bit of foundation, giving you some knowledge you need to know so that you can read it in context, because the New Testament is written for us, but it's not written to us. The New Testament was written a long time ago in time and place very different from our own, a language different from our own. And whenever you pick up something from some other time and place and you try to read it, there's always a little bit of a gap there, because they don't think about things exactly the same way we do. Their lives don't run on the same rhythms maybe that ours do. And so you pick up something and maybe you just don't automatically understand what the author is saying. Well, when we're reading the New Testament, we don't get to make up what it means. We don't get to just say, oh, well, I think this is what it means. What the author intended is very important, right? That determines the meaning of the text. So we want to read the New Testament with historical and cultural awareness. I'll give just a simple example. Jesus says, the fields are white unto harvest. Okay, well, what does that mean? Does that mean they're not ready for harvest? They are ready for harvest? Well, obviously, in this context, it means they're ready for harvest. But if you're not from that time and place, you might not know that sort of thing. Another example, in a recent sermon, I preached on the parable of the unforgiving servant. And so the servant owed 10,000 talents and was owed 100 denarii. If you know that that would be, say, $1 trillion and $15,000, then you understand the parable. But if you don't know, well, it's 10,000 talents seems to be a lot. How much is it? How much is it compared to 10,000 denarii? You kind of get it, but you can miss some things. And there are other things that are far more important than things like that. So we want to read with a historical and a cultural awareness so that we really understand what's going on in the text. And so I want to give you some background today. Let's talk a little bit about the New Testament world. And I'm going to share with you my PowerPoint here. Okay, let's see if we can get this to. You're not going to see me. You'll see the PowerPoint, which is probably not a bad thing. Okay, here we go. The Roman world. So Jesus is born into, and the New Testament church is born into the Roman Empire. The Mediterranean was a Roman lake during Jesus' ministry and during the time of the New Testament church. And that was a really, really good thing for the church, because the Roman peace meant that Christian missionaries could travel easily. So there are three things that really facilitate the spread of the gospel early on. One is that Rome ruled everything around the Mediterranean. Now, the gospel did go further east, but outside of the Roman Empire. But the fact that all these lands in the Roman Empire were not these little fiefdoms ruled by warlords with constant wars and different languages and things like that really helped the gospel to spread. So you had the Roman peace, You had the Greek language because Alexander the Great had conquered from Greece all the way to India. And because of that, Greek was the language of international finance and commerce and travel, and most people spoke Greek. It's kind of like English today. The whole airline industry, I think, is based on English. Most anywhere you go in the world, you can find people who speak English. So Greek was that way. That's why the New Testament was written in Greek. And so when Paul traveled to all these different places, he didn't have to learn 10 new languages to tell people about Jesus. He could speak in Greek. Now, the other thing that affected the spread of the gospel was the spread of Judaism. There were synagogues spread throughout the Roman Empire. Now, not in every place. Philippi didn't have one, for example, but most places Paul went to, he could find a synagogue, and he would go first to the synagogue and he would explain the gospel. And some people would believe and some people wouldn't. And when everybody had kind of made up their mind, then he would go to the Gentiles. And there were other Gentiles who were around the synagogue. They were called God-fearers. Luke talks about God-fearers. These are Gentiles who were attracted to the Old Testament and to the Jewish religion, but didn't go all the way and become practicing Jews. So you had the Jews, the God-fearers, and then the rest of the population. And so because there were little outposts of Judaism synagogues throughout the Roman Empire, there was a population there in each place where the gospel would make more sense. So Paul goes in the synagogue. He said, hey, look at the scriptures. Jesus is the promised Messiah, right? There's a natural bridge. There's a natural entry point. When Paul goes to, say, Athens, and he's speaking to pagans, he has to take a step back. They don't know about Abraham. They don't know about God's covenants. They're not looking for a Messiah. And he has to say there's one God who created everything, and he has to start a little bit further back. So the Roman piece, the Greek language, and synagogues spread throughout the empire really helped Christianity to spread at the beginning. I want to talk a little bit about the geography of the New Testament world. Especially here, you can see Judea, Samaria, Galilee. This is where Jesus' ministry takes place. So you can see Nazareth up here in Galilee. Nazareth is in the hill country. So Jesus is a hillbilly. If you're from East Tennessee or Western North Carolina or West Virginia, Jesus is one of us. So you get the hill country there. You can see the Sea of Galilee, where Jesus spent much of his ministry. Capernaum, that's where Simon Peter and some others were from. And you have over on the eastern side of the Jordan River, you have Gentile territory, and Jesus ventured there briefly. He went up in the region of Tyre and Sidon briefly. When he wanted to escape from the crowds, he went up to Caesarea Philippi. And I'm hoping you can see my mouse pointer and not just the map, but look for these places. And you can see Samaria in the middle, and Jesus had to pass through as he was going to Judea and Jerusalem. Jerusalem, of course, is where the temple is. And Jesus went to Jerusalem on more than one occasion, especially there at the end of his ministry during Holy Week and leading up to the cross. You always go up to Jerusalem. This is because Jerusalem is on a hill. So it doesn't matter whether you're coming north, east, south, or west, you're always going to go up to Jerusalem. Bethlehem, just a little bit south of Jerusalem there, is where Jesus was born. So in the region of Israel, you start with the Mediterranean Sea, then you have a coastal plain. Then you get into the hill country and you move east to the Jordan River, into the Dead Sea and the Sea of Galilee. Let's talk about the history a little bit of this so that you get that kind of background. Very important. So God makes a covenant with King David. This is 1,000 years before Jesus is born. And God says, one of your descendants is going to rule over my people forever. And so for hundreds of years, a descendant of David is on the throne in Jerusalem, ruling Judea. which is sometimes a little larger, sometimes a little smaller, but the descendant of David ruling there. And that changes in 597 when the Babylonians come. Well, actually, they left the descendant of David on the throne kind of as a puppet king for 10 years. But in 587, they came back because Jerusalem had rebelled and they conquered it. They tore down the walls, they destroyed the temple, and they removed the king descended from David. So God's people had had three things that were tangible expressions of God's presence and blessing and covenant with them. They had the land, the king, and the temple. Well, they lost all three of those. The prophet said, this is God's judgment. God is going to bring us back. And he did. The Persians conquered the Babylonians in 538. And Cyrus, king of the Persians, allowed the Jews to return and rebuild their temple. So the Babylonians had a policy. They said people will be easier to rule if we uproot them from where they live and shuffle them around. They left only the poorest of the poor to farm the land, and then they brought in other people, and these people mixed, and that's kind of where the Samaritans came from. Well, the Persians had exactly the opposite policy. They said, we're going to let people return to their lands, and they did, and the Jews were among those who went back. So they're under Persian rule for a couple of hundred years, and then Alexander the Great starts in Macedonia, and he starts conquering, and he doesn't stop until his army just gets tired of winning. So Alexander developed a military strategy known as the phalanx. They would have, his soldiers had long shields at which they would interlock and long spears, and they would come like a wall toward their opponents. And it was a tactic that nobody else was ready for. And so they began to conquer and they headed east. The Greeks and the Persians have been fighting for some time. If you've ever seen those movies about Sparta or the 300 or something, that's the Greek and Persian wars. Well, Alexander pushed through the Persian Empire and he kept going. He kept going through Afghanistan all the way to India. And he only stopped when, after like 20 years, his soldiers were like, we're done. We're tired. This is too much. We've conquered enough. So Alexander dies, and his empire splits into four parts, his four main generals each ruling a part of it. And so now Israel becomes part of Alexander's empire that gets broken up. And you have the Ptolemies in Egypt, the Seleucids in Syria. And naturally, once he's gone and his generals divide up his empire, what are they going to do? They're going to fight each other. And Israel is in the neutral zone, sort of between the Ptolemies and the Seleucids, and it goes back and forth. And finally, the Seleucids conquer it and seize control, and they have one of their rulers named Antiochus IV Epiphanes. And he decides that what his empire needs is religious unity. And they all need to worship the Greek gods. And so he has a policy of forcing everyone to worship his gods. And the Jews are very uncooperative. We'll say it that way, right? They're going to worship the one true God. And so he begins to persecute. He begins to conquer. He takes Jerusalem. He desecrates the temple. He puts a statue of Zeus in there. He sacrifices a pig on the altar. Anything he can do to offend and oppress. Well, it's just a little too much, and so they rebel. This is under Judas Maccabeus. If you've ever heard of the Maccabeans, this is what was going on 163 BC, and against all odds, the Jews win. They liberate the temple, they cleanse it, and that's where, of course, Hanukkah comes from, the Feast of Dedication, the Festival of Lights. So these are the Hasmoneans, and they're ruling from 163 to 63 BC. Now, there was a problem with the Maccabees, with this family. They were not descended from David, and they were corrupt. I guess that's two problems. But all of God's people who were looking forward to a Messiah, looking forward to all those promises the prophets had made, that God had made through the prophets. They realized, hey, we have home rule now. One of us is on the throne, but this is not what God said would happen. This is not the righteousness. This is not the peace. This is that God has promised. Well, they had a little bit of a civil war, and one of the sides turned to Rome and said, "Hey, Romans, you guys are really strong. Could you help us out? Could you maybe come in and help us get things in order?" The Romans are like, "Sure, we'll help." So they send an army, and then their army's there, and the Jews are like, "Great, thanks for your help." And they're like, "Well, we're here to stay. We kind of like the place, and we think we should be in charge." So in 163, Rome takes over Israel, and now it is under Roman occupation. And Jesus is born, and his nation is occupied by Rome. Now, the Romans wanted two things. One, tax revenue. They wanted to squeeze as much tax revenue as they could out of Judea and Samaria and Galilee. They also wanted peace. They didn't want uprisings and things like that. So they wanted to keep the peace and squeeze the taxes. Sometimes they ruled through a client king like Herod the Great. And Herod the Great was the king when Jesus was born. You remember he slaughtered the infants in Bethlehem, trying to get rid of Jesus, any potential Messiah, any potential king. And sometimes when Herod's descendants proved less capable than he was, and Herod was an ungodly man, certainly, but he built a lot of things. He built the temple grounds, and he built ports and forts and all kinds of things. But when his sons proved less capable than he was, the Romans ruled Judea directly. So that is why one of the descendants of Herod Antipas, when Jesus was on trial, he ruled Galilee. And so Pilate had sent Jesus to him. But then Pilate, who was a Roman, was in charge of Judea. So Jesus is born into this Roman world. And as I said, the Roman Empire helped the spread of the gospel. So the languages that people spoke, Aramaic was the everyday speech of people there in Israel and in Galilee. Most everyone spoke Greek, and Jesus, his native language would have been Aramaic. He probably spoke Greek as well. Nazareth is very close to a larger town called Sepphoris, and that was a very cosmopolitan city. We know from archaeology that it was a very Greekified Roman sort of city with all kinds of people. And Jesus, being a carpenter, he wouldn't just work in the little village where he lived. He would travel around and do jobs and building and construction and things like that. So, in all likelihood, Jesus spoke Greek. For example, when he's speaking to Pontius Pilate, it's unlikely that Pilate spoke Aramaic, and Jesus probably didn't speak Latin, so they probably had their conversation in Greek. The other language, of course, was Latin, the language of the Romans. And so the sign on Jesus' cross listing the charge, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews, that was in Aramaic, Greek, and Latin. Now, the region there was an agrarian society. Most people lived in villages and small towns. They would have a little village, and the flocks would be brought in at night. They would keep sheep and goats. They would also have farmland there around the village. When we think of farms, we think like Dorothy and the Wizard of Oz, a house in the middle of a big plot with fields all around it. They had a village in the center, and the fields then built around the village where people lived together in the village for safety and protection. So someone asked in the class, were any of Jesus' disciples farmers? And the answer is, we really don't know that. It doesn't say that they were. Certainly some were fishermen, and that was an occupation there around the Sea of Galilee. For the most part, that was an agrarian society. And let me say something about the major Jewish festivals. There were three main festivals, and we see Jesus going to Jerusalem for these festivals at different times, particularly in John's gospel. He's talking about the different festivals. Um, the first was Passover. This was in the spring. It was right at the beginning of the barley harvest. So there are two main harvests. In the spring, they harvest grain. First the barley, then the wheat. In the fall, they harvest the fruit, grapes, figs, dates, pomegranates, that sort of thing. So Passover, of course, the primary purpose is to commemorate the Exodus from Egypt. And it also is the beginning of the harvest festival. There are newborn animals and the beginning of the grain harvest. 7 weeks later, you have Pentecost or Shavuot. And this celebrates both the giving of the law and the end of the wheat harvest. So now the grain harvest is over. In the fall, you have tabernacles or Succoth. This was usually in October, and it celebrated the fruit harvest and also commemorating the wandering in the wilderness. So they would build these little booths or tabernacles. It's sometimes called the Feast of Booths, Feast of Tabernacles. And this had two purposes. One, to remind them that their ancestors had lived in these little, oh, I think I have a, yeah, okay, got a slide about this. They lived in these booths during the wilderness wandering. They lived in temporary dwellings. But it was also handy because when your fruit is ready to harvest, you're going to stay out there to make sure nobody comes and takes it. So these three festivals were both tied to the cycle of agriculture, but also rooted deeply in what God had done for Israel, the Exodus, the giving of the law at Mount Sinai, and the wandering in the wilderness to bring them to the promised land. These three festivals are important for understanding some things in the Gospels and what's going on. Now, first century Judaism was very divided, like most religions tend to be. I mean, if you look at Christianity today, we've got Eastern Orthodox, Catholic, Protestant. Within Protestants, you've got Presbyterians and Methodists and Baptists and Episcopalians and Lutherans and you name it, right? So Islam is the same way. You know, you have Sunnis and Shias and Alawites and who knows what else. And you know, human beings, we tend to be this way. And first century Judaism was this way. The religious life of Jews in the first century had two sort of focal points. One was the temple in Jerusalem. They went to the temple for the major festivals. The other center of life was the synagogue. And we know that Jesus was very observant. He went to the synagogue, he went to the temple for the festivals. He went to the synagogue on a regular basis. Luke says at one point, I think it's Luke chapter 4, Jesus went to the synagogue on the Sabbath as was his custom. So Jesus was a churchgoer, at least a synagogue goer. The synagogue service was very much like a service that we might have. There were songs and prayers, the reading of scripture, and preaching. And sometimes someone would be invited to bring the message. So Jesus is at his hometown synagogue in Nazareth, and they ask him to bring the message, and he gets the Isaiah scroll, and I have come to bring good news to the poor, and so on and so forth. Today it's been fulfilled in your hearing. Paul was often invited when he would go to a new town. He would go to the synagogue, and they would say, bring us a word. And he would say, well, you know, here's a passage that's interesting, and do you know about Jesus? So that was the synagogue. Now, within Judaism, there were several different groups. Not everyone was a part of one of these groups. Jesus' disciples who were fishermen, they probably weren't part of one of these groups. They were just busy making a living, but you had several groups. One group was the Essenes. This is the group responsible for the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, you think about Israel's under occupation from the Romans. there's several different strategies you could take to deal with this. One is you just withdraw from the world, right? You're kind of like monks. You're going to go off and you're going to do your own thing. And, all of you people are bad. We're going to go do our own thing over here. Then you have those who say, okay, Romans are bad. Let's take up our weapons and fight them. We got to defeat the Romans. We got to kill them. Then you have those who say, no, what we need is God to help us. We're going to be a national renewal movement. We need revival in this land. We need to call people back to God. Then you have those who say, well, we can compromise with the Romans. We don't like the Romans, but we could use them for our advantage. We have to get along with them, so we'll just do the best we can. And then finally, you would have those who would say, hey, you can't beat them, join them, right? The Romans are great. This is some opportunity right here. Let's get on board with what the Romans are doing. So those are your main options. And we see each of these groups taking one of those options. The Essenes, they're saying, okay, you people who run the temple in Jerusalem, you're just corrupt. We want nothing to do with you. The Romans are bad. We're going to be a pure community by ourselves. We're going to do our thing. Then you have the zealots, right? And the zealots are the ones who say, let's take up arms. Let's fight the Romans. There's only one thing the Romans understand, and that's force. Let's go get them. Then you have the Pharisees. And the Pharisees are that renewal movement. They're the ones who say, we need to be holy so that God will look with favor upon us. Now, there are two kinds of Pharisees during the time of Jesus and the New Testament. There are those who say, if we're holy enough, God will help us take up arms and defeat the Romans. So some of the Pharisees are very close to the zealots. And then there are other Pharisees who say, if we are holy enough, God will take up our cause and he will fight for us and we won't have to lift a finger. God will do it. So those are the Pharisees. They promoted extreme purity and holiness. They tried to observe in everyday life the Old Testament rituals prescribed for the priests in the temple. Now, the Pharisees are interesting because of all the groups, Jesus is closest to the Pharisees. They had a lot of theology in common. For example, the Sadducees, who I'm going to talk about in a minute, they didn't believe in angels. They didn't believe in resurrection, right? And Jesus believes in both. Now, someone asked me after the class, it's a great question, how could they know about the resurrection before Jesus? Well, in the first century, a lot of Jews, not all of them, but a lot of them had hope for eternal life. They believed that at the end of time, God would raise everyone, the righteous to reward and the wicked to punishment. So when Jesus tells Martha, your brother will live again, she says, I know that he will at the last day. Nobody expected the Messiah to die, and nobody expected him or anyone else to return in the middle of history. So Jesus' resurrection confirms this resurrection hope. But my point is, Jesus and the Pharisees were close on a lot of things. But Jesus also criticized the Pharisees harshly sometimes, because they became so legalistic. They had a lot of traditions and man-made things that they overlaid over God's law. And sometimes they lost sight of the main point, which was heart righteousness. So the Pharisees, some of them were friendly toward Jesus. There were some Pharisees who warned him that Herod wanted to kill him. Nicodemus was a Pharisee. He came to Jesus, right? And he becomes a follower of Jesus. Later on, Paul was a Pharisee who became a believer. But the Pharisees, for the most part, didn't like Jesus because he didn't fit their idea of what a Messiah or even a godly person should be. Because he did things like heal on the Sabbath, right? Now, some people would say, hey, he just healed this guy. That's pretty amazing. But the Pharisees are focused on, yeah, but he did it on the Sabbath. That's not right. So they got hung up in some of the stuff. You see Pharisees checking Jesus out. They question him. And so the Pharisees were part of the group that were opposed to Jesus. Another group opposed to Jesus was the Sadducees. Now, Sadducees are a much smaller group. These are the elites in Jerusalem. They run the temple. Now, by the way, the Pharisees tended to be people who were rich because people who had to work for a living, farming or fishing or building things, they didn't have time to practice all these rituals and do all this study that the Pharisees did. So only the rich could tend to become Pharisees. Then you have the Sadducees, and they're the ones who run things in Jerusalem, especially the temple. And they compromise with the Romans. They hate the Romans. They don't want anything to do with them, but they realize the Romans are in charge. There's nothing they can do about that. And so they're going to do the best they can to work with the Romans so that they can be in charge of the temple and keep all of that going. And then, of course, you have the Herodians, and the Herodians are the ones who are on board with the Romans. They're like, hey, the Romans are great. They're a lot of fun. Let's go be part of what they're doing. During the last week of Jesus' ministry, he's in the temple, and all these different groups come and they try to trap him. The Sadducees ask him a question about resurrection. The Pharisees and Sadducees and the Herodians come at one point and they ask him a question about paying taxes. And they think they have him because if he says pay taxes, then the Pharisees are going to denounce him. If he says don't pay taxes, the Herodians are going to go report him to the Romans. They think he can't win, but he turns the tables on them. Now, you have these groups, and I want you to think about what does it mean that Jesus has within his group of 12 disciples a zealot and a tax collector. So the zealots would be the kind of people who wanted to kill tax collectors. And somehow Jesus is able to have within his group both the zealot and the tax collector. That really says something about what God was doing in Jesus' ministry. Now, there was popular Jewish hopes. Remember, I talked about God's covenant with David and the promise of a descendant from David ruling over his people forever. Well, the faithful never gave up hope. Right? There's 400 years between the end of the Old Testament and the beginning of the New Testament. They never gave up hope that God was going to do that. And so they kept looking for a Messiah. They envisioned that primarily in terms of political freedom. They didn't realize that the Messiah was coming primarily to free them from sin and death, and that his mission would be as big as the whole world. Even though the prophets said that, they talked about the whole world coming to worship the one true God. Now, speaking of the one true God, let me say a few things about paganism. Because during Jesus' ministry, which is there just in the region of Palestine, but not in the Greek world, very quickly after his resurrection, when he sends his followers forth with a mission, they encounter the Gentile world, which of course is very, very different. The Greeks and Romans worshipped many different gods. Now, pagan religion tended to be transactional. Right? I'm sick, so I go to the temple of the God of healing and I make an offering, and then I get healed. I give God something, and God gives me something. The Greeks and Romans took their civic gods very seriously. They believed that if the proper rites were not performed and sacrifices made, the gods would get angry and they would cease to protect the city. And then it would be vulnerable to pestilence or natural disaster or invasion. You kept the city by buying off the gods, by keeping them happy. Pagan religion was not so much focused on beliefs. They don't really care what you believe, but on practices, the rituals, the sacrifices. And Christians were persecuted because they would not worship the Roman gods and they would not worship the emperors. And people thought that was antisocial because the whole life of the city was bound up in the temple. It was the bank, it was the meeting hall, it was a restaurant, it was everything. So if you're not going to the temple, you're not participating in the social life of the town. And then if you're not worshiping the gods of the city, then you're leaving the city vulnerable to pestilence and war and all that sort of thing. So they tried to persecute Christians to make them worship their gods. Now, Jews were exempt from this because the Romans tended to be anti-Semitic. And they thought the Jews were weird because, for example, the Jews kept the Sabbath. It was crazy. You take a day off every week. Nobody took a day off in the ancient world. There was no weekend. It was a 7-day work week. Now, every month there were 1 or 2 days that would be a holiday or a festival, but there was not a weekend as we know it. So they thought the Jews were weird for that. They only worshiped one God who did that. But the Romans tolerated the Jews because they recognized that they were an ancient people with ancient customs and they were following the traditions of their ancestors. And that was something the Romans could respect. But Christians were a bit of a different matter. Now, in the Roman world, you had a very different sexual ethic than in the Jewish world. Judaism was very strict about that kind of thing, and marriage was it, and faithfulness within the covenant of marriage. The Roman world was very immoral. Married women were expected to be faithful, but pretty much nobody else was. Women didn't have a lot of power or clout within the society. You did have some women like Lydia, who were business women, and sometimes a widow who was wealthy might be an influential person. But for the most part, women were second-class citizens and property. A woman was under the authority of her father until she was under the authority of her husband. Slavery was practiced in the Roman Empire. The empire was built on slavery. It was not based on race, but it was based on economics. You became a slave by taking out a loan and using yourself as collateral and defaulting on that loan. Or if you were captured in war, you could become a slave that way as well. Interestingly, most doctors and teachers in the ancient world were slaves. As you look at society, about 3% were elites. They were the wealthy and powerful. Then you had about 15% were a landowning class or some especially successful merchants and artisans, and they were well off. Then you had a middle class, maybe 25%. These were merchants, successful farmers, artisans, people who were relatively okay. Then you had about 30% were small farmers, shopkeepers, laborers who were barely getting by. You had about 25% unskilled laborers, widows, orphans, prisoners, the poor. These were people who struggled to survive. Roman society was very rigidly stratified, and the whole point of it was to climb the social ladder. You wanted to prove that you were better than others. And so what they wore, where they lived, who they ate with, all that stuff was designed to say, I am better than you. And when we see that some of that behavior in the church in Corinth, for example, we know that these new Christians were struggling to leave behind some of their pagan values. Now, thinking about the Roman world that Christianity goes to, the Christian message was not tailored to capitalize on what people already believed. Christians said that God had become a human being, which both Jews and Romans found too much to get their mind around. They're like, wait, God became a human being? That just doesn't make sense. For Greeks especially, they thought the body is evil, the spirit is good, because the spirit is unchanging, it's eternal, but the body is corrupt and it breaks down and dies, and that's just bad, that's evil. They didn't understand the fall. They didn't know God created the world good and then it became corrupt. They thought the world was just corrupt. And so the idea of resurrection to eternal life, who would even want that? Right? Because then you have your body and God becomes a human being. Those were difficult things for them to accept. And the biggest of all was the fact that Jesus had been crucified. So the Christians said, God came to us, he died on a cross, and he rose again. And they're like, wait, your God is a crucified Jew. Christians are like, yeah. And the Romans are like, that is just crazy. So the Romans thought Christianity was just a weird, dangerous superstition. What's amazing is that so many people came to believe the gospel. They brought this message. Paul even goes to the intellectual elites in Athens and he talks about the resurrection, and people make fun of him. And yet there were some who believed. And so you see the power of God as the gospel begins to spread. Now, again, why is all of this important? I've thrown a lot at you. In one way, it's not enough. There's so much to know, so much to learn. But I want you to have kind of a basic understanding of the land and the people so that when you're reading the New Testament, this stuff makes sense to you. And you go, okay, I know who that is. I know what's going on. It's very, very important. Now, having laid this foundation, next week we're going to look at the Gospels. The following week, the life of Jesus. And then we're just going to go through the New Testament in order. And already we're kind of in order because we start with the life of Jesus. We're going to just take things chronologically as they come. And before we're through, you are going to hear something about every single book in the New Testament. So I hope that that was a helpful introduction. If you have questions, you can send those in. We get some good questions in class. But I hope you're enjoying this and we'll stick with it. And God bless. Thanks.